stations coming up on Live Channel 4 will be the Senate floor. The Senate is reconvening. There will be a black sheet draped over John McCain's desk, and there will be a eulogy by Mitch McConnell. That will be on Live Channel 4. The White House flag is moved over to Live Channel 3.
I think it's fair to say the passion that John brought to his work was unsurpassed in this body. In more than 30 years as a senator, he never failed to marshal a razor-sharp wit, a big heart, and of course a fiery spirit. When John saw an issue the same way you did, you knew you had just found your most stalwart ally. You would thank your lucky stars. Because when you found yourself on the other side of that table, as I think all of us learned, you were in for a different kind of unforgettable experience. Either way, serving alongside John was never a dull affair. I found myself on both sides of that table over the years. John and I stood shoulder to shoulder on some of the most important issues to each of us, and we also disagreed entirely on huge subjects that helped define each of our careers. John treated every day, every issue with the intensity and seriousness that the legislative process deserves. He would fight like mad to bring the country closer to his vision of the common good. But when the day's disputes were over, that very same man was one of our most powerful reminders that so much more unites us than divides us. That we should be able to differ completely on policy and stay united in love of our country. And John himself once put it, we have nothing to fear from each other. We're arguing over the means to better secure our freedom and support the general welfare. But it should remain an argument among friends who share an unshakable belief in our great cause and the goodness of each other. John and I sure had those fights, and we sure had that friendship. I'm just glad we never found ourselves in opposite dugouts. Now, you see, John and I spent years as neighbors in the Russell Building. Often when softball season rolled around, our offices would take the field together as one united MAC team, we called it. Now, as a seriously wounded war hero and a childhood polio survivor, I'd have to say John and I didn't exactly have the makings of an elite double play duo. I took the mound once or twice, but I admit we mostly offered moral support. Moral support. Really, that's what John McCain gave this body and this country for so long. His memory will continue to give it. Because while John proudly served with us as the Senator for Arizona, he was America's hero all along. Just this month, Congress finalized a major bill for our all-volunteer armed forces that we named after John. This might seem like a small detail, but really, it was a fitting capstone for a career so thoroughly defined by service in and then service for the ranks of those who wear our nation's uniform. Generations of McCains have served with distinction in our great Navy. As John described his Scottish heritage in one memoir, the McCains were bred to fight, and fight they have. One by one, McCains have entered the Academy's gates in Annapolis. One by one, they marched past a centuries-old battle flag bearing the phrase, "Don't give up the ship." But while honorable service was in his DNA, John's story was never simple. At Annapolis, as he'd come to explain with some relish, his major distinctives were mostly the weakness of his grades and the length of his disciplinary record. The first miracle in John's military career was the fact that he somehow made it through school. But he prevailed, and bigger tests soon came. He stared death in the face aboard the USS Forrestal, and again when he was shot down and dragged and battered and broken into the hands of our nation's enemies. 5.5 hellish years in captivity, merciless beatings for the uniform he had worn and the values he would not renounce. That stubborn, rebellious streak went from a stumbling block to a saving grace. Stubborn virtue sustained John. He declined early release in solidarity with his brothers. He never gave up the ship. We all know this story, but while John didn't shy from sharing his experiences, he insisted he was no hero and no saint. He measured his life in simpler terms. When asked after this diagnosis last year how he'd like to be remembered, here's what he said. He served his country, and not always right, made a lot of mistakes, made a lot of errors, but served his country, and I hope could add honorably. He'll certainly get that wish. For many, the service and sacrifice that John rendered overseas would have been more than enough, more than a lifetime already. But somehow John McCain was convinced that he still owed his country more. In 1983, he arrived in Congress. John knew exactly what it meant to swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. When he was sworn in here in the Senate 4 years later, he was no stranger to pledging to protect the Constitution from enemies, foreign and domestic. The following years brought legislative accomplishments, to be sure. But while John's constituents were lucky to have him as their senator from Arizona, John also remembered our titles say United States Senator. He worked across the aisle on the Select Committee on POW/MIA Affairs, whose work helped heal the wounds of war and normalize relations with Vietnam. He led congressional delegations and overseas travel that were famously as grueling as they were educational. John was seemingly immune to jet lag, and he was never more excited than when he had an opportunity to share American values abroad. And of course, he was singularly devoted to the men and women of our armed forces. From countless visits with deployed units in Iraq and Afghanistan to his committee meetings right here in this body, John honored their sacrifices in a way that only he could. He never forgot that, but notwithstanding the grandeur of our military might and technical prowess, our armed services are made up of people, of our constituents, of volunteers, of the brave. John's favorite novel was Ernest Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls. I suspect we'll hear it quoted quite a bit in the days ahead. The lead character is an American expat named Robert Jordan who risked everything in the Spanish Civil War. He's a little bit brash, maybe a little hot-headed. In fact, he's a dynamite specialist whose specialty literally is blowing things up. And he goes down fighting right down to the book's final pages. I'm sure some of us can imagine why John might identify with this guy. I recently rediscovered something John wrote a few years ago about this book. He noted that his favorite literary hero wasn't some contrived caricature of a hero from central casting. The book is full of complexities. The character has to face all of the messiness of life and war. His idealism is challenged. But he realizes the imperfections of this world don't mean the concept of sacrifice is outdated. They don't make love of cause or country into something quaint or naive. They only make patriotism, service, and hope that much more noble and necessary. It takes one kind of heroism to undergo unimaginable pain and suffering as a POW, but then persist in loyalty. It takes another kind of heroism to sustain that passion for decades more, to withstand the slings and arrows of politics, the compromises, the disappointments, the defeats, and yet consider it a joy and an honor to serve. Few have either kind of heroism. John McCain had both. Fortunately, all that intensity came paired with a world-class sense of humor. As we all know, John really hated to lose. The line he used after his presidential campaigns still makes me laugh. Someone would ask, I was coping with defeat. And John would say, actually, I'm sleeping like a baby. Wake up every 2 hours and cry. Seriously, it's hard to describe this larger-than-life figure without lapsing into what sounds like cliches. We've all heard our whole lives about the importance of patriotism and self-sacrifice. But we cannot take that culture of commitment for granted. Because just like our nation's security and our American liberty, the very notion that some causes really are greater than ourselves only survives because service members and statesmen like John McCain will fight and even die to defend it. The bond between John and his country was so deep. But of course, other bonds ran deeper still. While John's colleagues grieve our own loss, we also send our love and support to those who know him even better. Those who call this man their husband, their son, their father, and grandfather. We stand with John's loving wife, Cindy. We stand with Doug, Andy, Sydney, Megan, Jack, Jimmy, and Bridget. We stand with his mother, Roberta, and with all John's devoted friends and loyal staff. Thank you for lending him to us longer than we had a right. Thank you for supporting him while he supported us. So John McCain has fought his last battles and cast his final votes. But the nation he loved is still not done with him yet. This week will be dedicated to remembering him. On Friday, he will lie in state here in the Capitol like other American heroes before him. As the days turn to weeks, I know we'll all eager to come together and collaborate on ways we can continue to honor his memory. Generation after generation of Americans will hear about the cocky pilot who barely scraped through Annapolis, but then defended our nation in the skies, witnessed to our highest values even through terrible torture, captured the country's imagination through national campaigns that spotlighted many of our highest values, and became so integral to the United States Senate where our nation airs and advances its great debates. America will miss her devoted son, her stalwart champion, her elder statesman. I will miss one of the very finest gentlemen with whom I've had the honor to serve. But we will not forget him. I consider it our privilege to return some small share of the love that John poured out for this country. It is our honor as Americans to say to the late, great John Sidney McCain III what we pray he has already heard from his Creator. Well done, good and faithful servant. Well done. You fought the good fight. You finished the race. You kept the faith. And you never gave up the ship.
Madam President.
The Democratic leader.
On Saturday, August 25th, 2018, 9 years to the day since the death of his friend, Senator Kennedy, our friend and colleague, Senator John S. McCain, passed away. Knowing his prognosis prepared us for the inevitable, but it has not softened the blow. We feel a great and inexpressible loss. I know I do. But I also feel lucky that I was able to call this great man a friend. Today I'd like to share a few reflections, unorganized and incomplete though they may be. I suspect I'll have more to say about Senator McCain with the benefit of a few days' time. Senator McCain and I didn't get along very well at first. He was close to my mentor in the Senate, Ted Kennedy, but not so with me. I never served with Senator McCain on any committee where you get to know other senators up close. Before our friendship, my closest brush with him was over a comment he made during a debate on defense policy, where he said that Long Island was, quote, regrettably part of the United States. I blasted John's pejorative, which of course prompted him to reply from the Senate floor, quote, I'm sorry there's at least one of my colleagues that can't take a joke. I apologize if I offended him and hope that someday he will have a sense of humor. Like many, I was a victim of Senator McCain's acerbic wit. Now things began to defrost when we worked together during the Gang of 14 to avoid a change in the Senate rules during the Bush administration. And a real tight and lasting friendship emerged from our collaboration on immigration reform. We worked in close quarters for nearly a year, hour after hour, day after day, week after week, fine-tuning the only piece of major immigration reform to pass this chamber in decades. We visited the southern border together to assess the gaps in our security up close. We were doing what the Senate was supposed to do, grappling with the biggest challenges, working in a bipartisan way to find solutions, overcoming obstacles that have so long bedeviled immigration reform and continue to stymie progress today. We couldn't have done it without John McCain. In recent days, many have reflected on his presidential campaigns and his military service, rightly so. But he was also a natural legislator, able to seek common ground, sense where to go, knew when to give a little, knew when not to. He had deep principle, but he also knew how to craft a product that could actually pass, and the bill did in the Senate with large numbers of supporters from both parties. Had we passed immigration reform then, had the House done what the Senate did under John's leadership, we wouldn't be quarreling about immigration now, and our country would be a better, stronger, and more unified place. We became so close over that year that John McCain started treating my staff like they were his own, and me the same. We spoke so frequently, I knew John McCain's cell number by heart, and I mistakenly repeated it during an interview when a reporter asked me how close we were. They had to edit it out to protect John's privacy. I can truly say that the time we spent authoring and passing immigration reform were some of the proudest days in politics for me and the rest of the Gang of Eight, in no small part because the success was shared with one great leader, one great legislative leader, John McCain. You know, he was so many things to so many people, a fierce friend to those who were lucky enough to have earned his friendship. You had to earn his friendship. A real thorn in the side of those who earned his scorn. Many know that. He was an unofficial ambassador for the United States, a comfort to our allies, an unabashed champion for Western values. He was unafraid to take on presidents. He was unafraid to take on his own party. He was equally parts funny and furious, foul-mouthed and statesmanlike. He could put the temper in temperament. He was a brave and honest man. He was a patriot. He was all those things throughout his life, usually more than one at once, until his very last days. Remarking on the character of America, Senator McCain said that we live in a, quote, big, boisterous, brawling, intemperate, restless, striving, daring, brave, good, and magnificent country, truer words could not be said about the man himself. Big, boisterous, brawling, intemperate, restless, striving, daring, brave, good, and magnificent. As you go through life, you meet a few truly great people. John McCain was one of them. His dedication to his country and to the men and women who serve and protect it was unsurpassed. Even in his last weeks, he was calling me every few days to make sure that our defense authorization bill was done and done right. Not for him, not for his glory, because he cared about the men and women who serve in our armed forces so deeply. His life is a story of American heroism personified. But maybe most of all, he was a truth teller. Perhaps it's a reflection of our politics that a man can be so well regarded for simply telling the truth as he saw it. Or maybe, recognizing the demands and failings of our politics, it's more a reflection on the man, that 4 decades of public life could not warp or dim his fidelity to the unvarnished truth. I will miss him dearly. In the past year of his illness, during moments of doubt about the direction of our country, I found myself thinking about what John McCain would do or what he would say if he were here. Truth be told, there's nothing that I could say that could possibly add or detract from Senator McCain's illustrious career. There's nothing any of us have done that compares to the sacrifice he made in a cell block half a world away and half a lifetime ago. A sacrifice he made over and over again for the country he loved and the principles he advanced. So that generations will study his example, I propose we rename the Russell Senate Office Building, one of only 3 Senate office buildings after John McCain. It would be a fitting tribute to a man who considered his service here in the Senate, headquartered in the Russell Building, where his beloved Armed Services Committee also resides, the most significant of his distinguished career. The man whose name he would replace, Senator Richard Russell, a towering figure in the Senate of his day, was nonetheless an avowed opponent of civil rights and the architect of the Southern filibuster that long delayed its passage. It's time that we recognize that as times change, so do our heroes. So I'll be introducing a resolution with Senator Flake to change the name of the Russell Building to the McCain Building. I hope my colleagues will co-sponsor and support the resolution. But it need not be the only way we honor Senator McCain. We can honor him by trying to carry out the principles he lived by. We can try, as he did, to put country before party. We can try, as he always did, to speak truth to power. And we can try, as he summoned us to try, to restore the Senate to its rightful place in our national political life. Up until the very end, John McCain still believed the Senate was capable of solving our country's greatest challenges. He believed that our arcane rules and procedures, designed to frustrate one-party rule, were an antidote to the polarization of our politics. At the very least, he believed in the Senate's ability to make progress, to set aside for a moment our party affiliations, political interests, and personal ambitions in the service of a larger cause. Because that's what he did. And for all his cynicism, he still believed the Senate could reach that higher calling. Deep in the middle of his final speech on the Senate floor were these words, quote, "I hope we can again rely on humility, our need to cooperate, on our dependence on each other, learn how to trust each other again, and by doing so, better serve the people who elected us." If we are to truly honor the life, and the service of John McCain. Let us do that. Let us do that. I yield the floor. Well, I also, Madam President, John McCain put out a few final words. Today, I think some of his staffers put them out. I'd like to read just 2 paragraphs of that and then ask unanimous consent that they be put in the record. I have often observed, McCain wrote, that I'm the luckiest person on earth. I feel that way even now as I prepare for the end of my life. I have loved my life, all of it. I've had experience, adventures, and friendships, enough for 10 satisfying lives, and I am so thankful. Like most people, I have regrets, but I would not trade a day of my life in good times or bad times for the best of anyone else's. And finally, he concluded with this: do not despair of our present difficulties, but believe always in the promise and greatness of America, because nothing is inevitable here. Americans never quit. We never surrender. We never hide from history. We make history. Farewell, fellow Americans. God bless you. God bless America. I yield the floor.
They'll be entered without objection. Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Department of Health and Human Services, Lynn A. Johnson of Colorado to be an Assistant Secretary for Family Support.
Senator from Maine.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Madam President, the United States Senate, indeed our entire nation, is mourning the loss of a great leader and American patriot, our colleague and friend, Senator John McCain. Madam President, I first met John McCain when I was a young staffer in Senator Bill Cohen's office, and John was serving as the Navy's liaison officer. As a fellow senator for the past 21 years, I knew him as a trusted colleague, a courageous legislator, and a close friend. John was a true American hero who devoted his life to serving his country. Courage and character were the hallmarks of his military service, as well as his work in Congress. In the Senate, he was a consequential leader on the most critical issues facing our country. John McCain was one of our Congress's most respected voices for a strong national defense and for good government. His word was as much his bond in Washington as it was to his brothers in arms in Vietnam. Madam President, I'd like to share with my colleagues a story that I believe demonstrates the essential character of John McCain. In November of 2010, John was part of a congressional delegation on its way to a security conference in Nova Scotia. Bad weather caused their flight to be diverted to Bangor, Maine, where I live. I shortly received a phone call to come to the airport, and I went and welcomed John and my colleagues on their unplanned visit. As it happened, the troop greeters of Maine were at the airport at the same time. This legendary group of citizens has greeted more than 1.5 million service members, either leaving to go overseas or returning home since 2003, never missing a single flight, even in bad weather or the middle of the night. And the presiding officer, I believe, who also has served her country so well, Senator Ernst, was one of those who was greeted by the troop greeters in Bangor, Maine. Rather than fly out when the weather cleared, John, the others in the delegation, agreed to stay and join me with the long line of these patriotic troop greeters to await the arrival of the airplanes. And I remember when I told John that there was a plane that would be arriving shortly, and then there was another one in a couple of hours. He said, "Of course we'll stay." Well, Madam President, you can imagine having gone through the gauntlet of Mainers greeting and welcoming the troops back home, hugging them, cheering them, giving them cell phones, thanking them for their service, that all of a sudden the troops realized that they'd just shaken hands with John McCain, the legendary John McCain, who was so popular with service members. And I saw them literally do a double take when the first group went by, shook his hand, and then turned around and said to each other, "Wasn't that John McCain who just shook our hands?" They then came back and, of course, posed for pictures and chatted with him and held up the rest of the line, who are very eager to see John. I will never forget how thrilled these troops were to be greeted when they were first setting foot back on American soil by a true American hero, John McCain, someone who had served our country with such courage and character. By the end of the day, John had spent 3 hours greeting 2 plane loads of soldiers. He loved greeting them and posing for pictures. It was such a heartwarming, unexpected event and a very special moment. And it not only gladdened the hearts of the troops, but also of the troop greeters, who were thrilled to have their hero with them. It was vintage John McCain that he stayed even after the weather had cleared and greeted each and every one of those troops. John McCain did what he thought was right, regardless of the political consequences. He had absolutely no interest in scoring partisan political points on the Senate floor. He welcomed and would listen to good ideas, whether they came from the Democratic or the Republican side of the aisle. While he was always open to new evidence, good ideas, and was capable of changing his mind, he was unshakable when he was convinced of the appropriateness of a course of action. John was impatient. He wanted to get on with solving the problems facing our country. He had no use for the political games that sadly far too often are played in the Senate. One often overlooked aspect of John was his love for the environment. I once visited him at his beloved ranch in Sedona, and I was surprised when he took me all over the property, pointing out birds, naming them, and clearly taking such delight in the wildlife. Until that moment, I did not know of his interest and love for nature. Later on, I accompanied John on a trip he organized to the Arctic to see the permafrost melting and to meet with native Alaskans. We also traveled to Antarctica, where we spent 4 days meeting with scientists who told us of the impact of global warming. He took me on so many trips and broadened my horizons. 4 times we went to Afghanistan, 4 times to Iraq. We went to Yemen. We went to Libya and met with Colonel Gaddafi before he was overthrown and killed. John taught me so much on these trips. The principles that guided John's lives are best summed up by his own words from his beautiful autobiography, Faith of My Fathers. He said, "Glory belongs to the act of being constant to something greater than yourself, to a cause, to your principles, to the people on whom you rely and who rely on you in return." John McCain was a statesman and a dear friend who was devoted to a cause greater than himself. And that cause was the United States of America. It has been an honor to serve alongside him for nearly 21 years in the United States Senate. Although he will be deeply missed by all of us, he leaves behind an extraordinary legacy that will inspire Americans for generations to come. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator from Georgia.
Madam President, yesterday was a difficult day for me. And before I get into that day, let me recognize the Senator from Oklahoma for a motion.
I thank the Senator from Georgia. I ask unanimous consent that at the conclusion of the remarks from the distinguished Senator from Georgia, that I be recognized for such time as I shall consume.
Without objection.
Madam President, yesterday was a difficult day for me. I'm 74 years old. I was born in 1944. Like many Americans, my youth was during the Vietnam era. My prime of my youth was the Vietnam era. In fact, my senior year in college, I got a graduation diploma and a draft notice the same day. They were put in the same book. Everybody was going, or everybody was being called up for the draft. There was a lottery, but so many people were eligible that almost everybody in my age group would have been drafted if they didn't join the service. I joined the National Guard, which I'm very proud of and still a guardsman to this day. But it also gave me the chance to serve my country in a way that would not put me as much risk to go to Vietnam as it would if I was drafted. But I consciously did that because I wanted to do everything I could to stay here and get married a few months later to my wife, Diane. But I was of the age to be drafted, and I made the decision to find a way to serve that would not put me in a position of being drafted where I lost control. And I was able to do it, and a lot of people were, but a lot of people weren't. And I know that. And the ones that could know it and the ones that couldn't know it. And the President knows what I'm talking about, being a guardsman herself. I lost my best friend in Vietnam, Jackson Elliott Cox III, Waynesboro, Georgia, Liberty County, bird dog capital of the world. Jack and I graduated from college together, and Jack went off for a weekend and came back and told us all he joined the Marine Corps, was going to OCS and was going to go to Vietnam and fight the bad guys. We all said, Jack, don't volunteer to do that. You could get killed. He said, no, I ought to do it. It's a great country. I've had a great life. Go to the University of Georgia, have a wonderful mom and dad, good friends like y'all. I want to go to OCS and be an officer of the Marine Corps. And he did. 2 years later, he was shot in the 11th month of a 13-month stint in Vietnam by a sniper. Alex Crumley, the Superior Court judge in Georgia years later, Pierre Howard, the Democratic Lieutenant Governor of Georgia and myself, we were the three best friends, the four amigos, if you will. We went to 589 Liberty Street in Waynesboro and spent 3 nights and 4 days with Emily and Jack, Jack's dad and mom. When the Marine Corps brought the body back, it lied and stayed in their dining room. We had a wake and a service for it. We stood guard. We cried, we talked about the good times, we talked about the bad times. But we felt sorry for ourselves because the life that had meant so much to all of us was gone. But Jack felt a calling for the country. He did a great service for the country, and I'm proud of him, and I'm proud to have been his friend. I tried to do what I could, but never in the category of a John McCain or Jack Cox. There were a lot of people my age that didn't do as much as they probably could have or might have done. And probably from time to time have second thoughts about it too, because the Vietnam War was so tough. I had friends coming back who had to dress in blue jeans and khakis when they got off the troop train from wherever they were to Atlanta, because the people they would get accosted on the street if they were in their uniform during that era. You know, today we go to the airport and we have troops come through that are going to fly back for duty somewhere, and they get standing ovations. People give up their seats to let them sit there. It wasn't like that in the 60s and 70s. It wasn't like that at all. In fact, the people who were risking their life, and in many cases 58,000 of them did give their life for all of us, we were making fun of them as a nation. It was terrible. It messed up our politics, messed our country, messed up our people, messed up everybody else. But America's a great country. And as much as what I'm telling you is tragic to me, and I apologize to everybody that I didn't do everything I should have done, but I think all of us owe each other a commitment to say, you know, we're never going to let America get that way again. America's going to always be like it was on 9/11 or 9/12/2001, when we all put American flags on our cars, we all sang the national anthem, we all did the Pledge of Allegiance after we'd been attacked. We rallied, and for a few months we were the most patriotic nation in the world. We ought to be that way every single day, because every single day there are those, just like those firemen and emergency medical people in 9/11, there are those in the Vietnam War who signed up, who fought, risked their life, in some cases died, like John McCain, like my brother-in-law, Rocky Davison, my wife's brother, who flew to the Navy A-4 reconnaissance planes in Vietnam, one of the most decorated pilots of the Navy during that era. People like him were great. Like my father-in-law flew reconnaissance in World War II in the Pacific, did everything he could to help the country during a difficult time there. There's so many people that did that in our country. We owe them all a debt of gratitude and a debt of thanks. But we need to all remember we're all Americans. We owe those who've saved us as a country, kept our freedom when we were about to lose it, fought for us, risked their lives, and died for us. We owe them at times like this to elevate them to the appropriate place in history, and that's what I'm trying to do with John McCain today. I want to elevate John. John was better than me, and I know it. John was the best of my generation. John McCain was and is a great human being. I don't know what's going to be said in the next few days about John McCain, by whomever it's going to be said. I don't know what's going to be done. But anybody who, in any way, tarnishes the reputation of John McCain deserves a whipping. Because most of the ones who would do the wrong thing about John McCain didn't have the guts to do the right thing when it was their turn. We need to remember that. So I would say to the president or anybody in the world, it's time to pause and say, this was a great man. He gave everything for us. We owe him nothing less than the respect that he earned. And that's what I intend to give John in return for what he gave me. John took me to Kosovo 20 years ago when Clinton said we're going to send some people over to verify the crime sites, the ethnic cleansing. Went to Pristina with John. Went to Montenegro. Went to the World Security Conference in Munich a few years after that. Got to sit with Vladimir Putin at that. Saw John McCain talk to Vladimir Putin like they were next-door neighbors, but also like they were Dutch uncles. I was so proud to be in a country that had a guy like John McCain who could break the ice with the toughest of our adversaries and speak up with pride for America and call them down when they need to be called in. Yeah, John and I had some problems too. Mitch McConnell did me the worst favor of my lifetime when he made me the chairman of the Ethics Committee. That's a hard job. And nobody likes the person who's chaired of the Ethics Committee because they're scared of you. But I got the Ethics Committee job at a time when John McCain was put on the special committee for the Ethics Committee to decide what to do on using airplanes during campaign events as candidates or for our PACs. John had access to a plane which gave him an exemption from the rules that we'd passed. Made it tough as heck because he didn't have to worry about the cause and effect. But John took a second to understand the problems a normal legislator who might not have had access to a private plane would have. And in the end, John took his circumstances and his abilities to have a private plane and applied it to the changes that we made to see to it everybody's being treated fair. John didn't just expect things to be good for John. He expected them to be good for everybody. And he always did that, and I always learned a lot from him. The other thing I learned was how to cuss. Now, let me tell you, John McCain could do a lot of things, but cuss is one of the best things he ever did. He was a consummate cusser. And he knew how to do it to have emphasis added. That's what the papers always say when they put the pound marks and things like that after some statement Jim Inhofe makes or I make. But John, he and I were working on a deal. I am chairman of the Veterans Committee. He was chairman of the Armed Services Committee. We had a huge veterans bill we had to come together and meeting the minds on in terms of health care. John was late to the meeting. He came in the meeting, pulled the door behind him, slammed it, and for 10 minutes laid the best cussing on me and everybody else in the room I ever heard. He said, now I haven't got time to put up with this anymore. Y'all just listen to what I got to say and tell me what you're going to do. That's a tough way to do business. But John sometimes knew to get us all to think, get us all to talk, that if he intimidated you enough so you'd fight for what you believed in, you'd get a better piece of legislation than if he just let you pass or if he intimidated you to death. John knew exactly what he had the capability of doing, and he knew exactly when to apply the intimidation and the thanks and the grace. And he did it at the right time every single time. Did we agree all the time? No. But I know I'm a better person, my country's a better country, and the world's a better place because of John McCain. In the next 3 or 4 days as we go through and we run into kids that we know or relatives or my own children that I'll be with this coming Sunday in the mountains, we're going to have a little meeting about John McCain. Just to make sure they know, I know that they know what I know about a great American hero. Because I want them, when they have kids in their 40s, like my kids are in their 40s today, they'll remember on Veterans Day, on Memorial Day, on all other days, the John McCains of the world and those that will come after John, who put their life and their future and their fortune on the line for the greatest country in the world, the United States of America. And I yield back my time. And note the absence of quorum.
Madam President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Did you put us in a quorum prior to that?
Senate is not in a quorum call.
All right, that's good. I can't think of anything more difficult than to speak after the last two speakers. Of course, I've known them for a long time. They're two totally different, opposite people. You have Susan Collins is a well-recognized moderate. She's one who understands and has a great appreciation for the environment. Not the kind of person that you would associate with a tough guy like John McCain that's gone out there and has done things that other people haven't done and just talked about. And then you hear the statement from the senator from Georgia. It just, you know, I was thinking about that. I'm a few years older than he is, and we have a lot of things in common. He's talking about being drafted. You know, I was drafted. I always remember I was enrolled, this is many, many years ago. I was going to be at the University of Mexico in Mexico City in an international program. And so I was at that time at the University of Colorado. And I did all of my finals and all of that early so I could get back in time to go down to Mexico. And so I got back to Tulsa, where I'm from, and I got a letter from a very important person. the President of the United States. And I thought how nice of Eisenhower to remember me. And it was my draft notice. And so that changed my life. But it changed my life in a way that was it is the greatest single experience that I've ever had. And I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today if it had not for that. The discipline that comes with being in the military. And then there are always heroes that you deal with. And we are dealing with a hero, and we deal with Senator McCain. You know, I've often said that I think Timothy, when he wrote 2 Timothy 4:7, had John McCain in mind when he said, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. That's exactly what he did. Kind of a mean guy. You know, a lot of people didn't like John McCain. He wasn't the most lovable person to be around. But he was a fighter, never shied away from a good fight. He was passionate for the causes that he believed in, a strong advocate for human rights and democratic values, standing up for oppressed people around the world. You know, that was the soft side of John McCain that a lot of people don't know about. But he was a fighter, but not just a fighter. He was a fighter for the people of Arizona. You know, after he got back from the time that he spent in prison, he got back to Arizona and he started fighting again. He did that for 36 years after his incarceration. He was shaped by his own military service and that of his father and grandfather. It's been said several times, statements about his father and grandfather. I've done some studying on them, and that is really what formed John McCain. Both of them were admirals in the Navy, and it's natural that he was going to be in the Navy, and of course he was. And during his leadership in the Senate Armed Services Committee, he continually focused on impact. Now, those of individuals, the occupier of the chair right now has served on the Armed Services Committee with Senator McCain, and she knows, as I know, and anybody else who's served with him, that he was always for the underdog, always for the troopers out in the field. And I think that the senator from Maine articulated that very well, the people that he had compassion for. We'd always take care of the soldier and the sailor and the airman and the Marines. He articulated this, by the way, in one of his books, the Faith of My Fathers. He was talking about his father and his grandfather. And this is a quote, and this says it better than any of the rest of us could say it. He said, an officer's obligations to enlisted men are the most solemn of all. An officer must not confer his responsibilities on the men under his command. They are his alone. He does not put his men in jeopardy for any purpose that the country has not required they serve. He does not risk their lives and welfare for his sake, but only to answer the shared duty they are called to answer. And that's Senator McCain. He looked after those individuals who were under his command. He was a ferocious opponent. But the key thing about Senator McCain is he was willing to take on those tough debates with you and become more and more rare in this chamber. We don't see him like we used to. But John would relish the debate, earning respect and admiration of everyone. I can remember there are so many areas because of all the years that we served together, not just in the Senate Armed Services Committee, but also in his time in the House and my time in the House. We had differences of opinion. And I think I'm a little bit stubborn sometimes too. And I remember one was the commissary issue. I mean, that got pretty violent before it was over. And we took on each other. The BRAC issue, he wanted to have another BRAC round in this last defense authorization bill. And I didn't want one because I thought anything we shouldn't be doing is closing down missions right now that we may be needing as we're rebuilding. So we had an honest, different opinion. I remember in 2003, that was back when everyone was jumping on this whole global warming thing, and that was going to be everyone's ticket to the White House. And I remember when John, they had the McCain-Lieberman bill, and I remember that lasted 3 days of debate, 3 days of debate, and I had hardly any senators come down on my side of the issue. But we won anyway. And after that was over, and that was one that John had his heart in, he came over to me and said, "Good job, you won, I lost." And that was it. No hard feelings. And that's the kind of person that John McCain is, one that we will never forget. I can remember a lot of people look at Oklahoma and they think it's always been a Republican state. It wasn't. It wasn't until well after 1994. 1994, I ran for the United States Senate. Now, it was kind of interesting because it was a Democrat state. I had this guy that was kind of the darling of the Democrat Party that was my opponent, and I thought and nobody would come out and help me. Only 3 senators came out and helped me during that race, and they were Senator Grassley, Senator Bob Dole, and John McCain. Now, John McCain came out, and I always remember this because we had a lot of things that we had in common, but I hardly knew the guy. But he came out, not just once, he came out twice. But the first time he came out, because he has a background in aviation, I have a background in aviation, and I remember I had a nice air-conditioned twin-engine plane, but I lost an engine the night before. So I had to fly my kid's plane. It was a very hot, it's called a little Grumman Tiger, and it doesn't have any air conditioning. It was in the 90s. It got close to 100 that day. And we started out, and I wrote down the different places we went. We first went to Oklahoma City, and then we flew to Shawnee, where he visited the Vietnam Memorial at that time. Then we flew to Lawton. Lawton happens to be the home of Fort Sill, which is the #1 area in the whole world for artillery. And we did our thing there all the time. He was campaigning for me, a guy who couldn't win. We went from there to Altus Air Force Base. That was one that was is still actually one of the real top training bases. And we now train C-17s, KC-135s. In fact, a lot of it due to John and several of us on the committee were flying the will be flying the KC-46, and of course this is long before that. But anyway, we worked and ended up with in Bartlesville, and then hosting a dinner, a fundraiser for me with the NRA, who was there. Now, I know that he, I guess, wanted to spend more time in that plane because he came back 2 weeks later, and we also did the same thing. Now, there was no reason for him to do that, because we hardly knew each other when it started. We got to know each other a lot better up there in all that heat. But nevertheless, he was there. And you always remember people who help you when nobody else would. So you can say a lot of things about John McCain. You've heard him on the floor. You're going to hear more. The hero, the patriot. But what's never in dispute is John McCain. He was a fighter above all and was deeply loyal to his country and his family and his constituents. And he was a patriot and always faithful. We all know that patriotism and loyalty to your country isn't based on your words. You have to live it, and of course he did that every day. As a young naval officer following his family's footsteps, his father and his grandfather, John kept the faith. He graduated from the Naval Academy. It was kind of interesting. He never talked about being the outstanding student and all that. In fact, he used to say, I was 5th in the class, 5th from the bottom. And, but he became a naval aviator and was deployed during the Vietnam War. He flew 23 missions and then was shot down in enemy territory. And we all know the story. We know that he kept his faith, and we know that it bears repeating the 5 years in the North Vietnamese. I actually remember going there and seeing the conditions under which he was during that period of time. And here's a guy who had the opportunity, because both his father and grandfather were admirals. He had the opportunity, if he wanted to bail out, and he didn't do it. He just wanted to be there. He didn't want to have any special kind of a treatment. So that was John. And after the Navy, John kept his faith by continuing to serve his country, this time as a congressman, then a senator, and ultimately the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. He also kept the faith on causes he believed that were just, not wavering from under political pressure. And now we all grieve because John has finished his race here on earth and on his own terms and surrounded by his friends and his loving family. John served his country faithfully for 60 years. We owe him a great debt for that service. This week, we will mourn him, and we'll honor him, and we'll be celebrating the truly remarkable life of an American hero. So we all have our John McCain story, a time when we were moved by his stubbornness, his courage, his passion, sometimes all three at the same time. I look forward to hearing these stories and tributes from my good friends. We all grieve for Cindy and the family, and they'll continue to be in our prayers. And lastly, I do believe, now that I've thought about it, that's what Timothy had in mind when he wrote, I have fought this good fight, I have finished the race, and I have kept the faith. So we say, thank you, John McCain. I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.